And so one of the first things the communists did was they introduced an indexing system. They established a certain number of units for the price of coal, of edible oil, of cloth, cotton cloth, and of grain, and maybe there was something else. Anyway, these formed an index, and the index was printed in the paper every morning, and if you received a salary, you received it according to that index, not in the number of dollars, but in the number of that index. And if you put money in the bank, you could take it out. You didn't dare put money in the bank before because it would disappear overnight with the inflation. Now that money was guaranteed, so you got it back according to the index. And within, I would say 6 months, inflation was completely defeated. And it was hard. I mean, there was so much devastation in the country. But the communist slogan was that for communists, and that included their army and so on, 3 men would have to live on 2 men's food, or 2 persons. I get men and persons kind of mixed up sometimes. But anyway, that was, these were the measures that they took, and they won support. They also had unusual ways of dealing with things. One of the common things for merchants in those days was to put sand in rice, dampen flour, take flour out of a bag and then dampen it so that the bag would then swell up and be full. And you never knew what you were getting. So when the merchants got caught, before they'd just pay a small bribe. This time when they got caught, there was no bribe. What happened was that they had to print an apology in the newspaper. And with the Chinese feeling for face, this was more devastating than paying a tremendous amount of money, more devastating than any fine, and more to be feared. Just the idea of having to admit that you were so cheesy in public was terrible. So, they did a lot of things that made people feel encouraged and feel good, and at that time there was no talk about really communism. This was just trying to get the society functioning. That was all.
And then you were saying that your perceptions or your feelings about being there started to change at some point, that you felt that you were more visible as white Americans and were feeling some kind of repression?
Well, it was curious. You see, one of the things that happened was that we used to take the bus from the university into the city. And under the Kuomintang, which none of us liked, but we would go in, and when we got to the city gate, all the Chinese would have to get off the bus and be searched and hassled by, show documents to the Kuomintang troops at the gate. While we just sat there, twiddling our thumbs. Then, after the revolution, when we got to the gate, I was the one who had to get off and show my papers. Well, it was ridiculous because, everybody knew everything about it. When you have blue eyes and a big nose and big feet and you're wandering around China, everybody knows everything about you. But I still had to go through this formal, and I was seething about it. And I complained about it to a Chinese friend of mine who was a professor, had gotten his degree at Harvard and taught at Harvard for a while. And he wore an American jacket, tweed jacket, and smoked a pipe, and he was more American than I was. I was wearing Chinese clothes and so on at that time, but he was always dressed like an American professor. And I complained about it. And when I got through complaining, he just broke up laughing, and he said, "Brother, you should have had to go through American immigration sometime." This sort of a thing. And he was really enjoying my misery. Well, some of that, you took as fun, but I finally began to wear you down as this feeling of, well, they just don't understand. America's not that bad. There's a lot of things wrong with it. And the other thing that you find that happens when you're overseas and other people start, Americans have this tradition of complaining about the government. We complain about the president. We complain about this. We complain about that. But you go overseas and some foreigner does it, and immediately the hackles grow up in the back of your neck, and you find yourself on the defensive. And it's sort of a built-in conditioning that happens, and I suppose it happens to everyone. You know, my kids, I want to spank my kids myself. I don't want anybody else criticizing them. Something, I guess, is part of that sort of syndrome. Whatever. I began to feel more and more hostile. And then when it came to the Chinese going into Korea, I had one of these Helicopter shortwave radios, and the Chinese had taken the sending device out of it, but they'd let me keep the radio. So I would listen to the Voice of America, and when the Marines were retreating down to Wonsan and Ham Hong, you know, I'd stay up all night listening for news of it. And it was funny because I'd been in the Marine Corps during the war, and I never thought of any group that was any more stupid or, you know, in those days, the enlisted Marines couldn't even have hip pockets because they might have something that would be an unsightly bulge. It was just that kind of an outfit, and I thought my military experience was about the one boring experience I've had in my whole life. And still, when it came to that push comes to shove, I identified completely with the retreating Marines, and of course that didn't make me popular at all with my Chinese friends.
So then what happened? I mean, now we want to kind of come to the title of your talk.
Well, what happened then was that, as I said, I'd been in naval intelligence, and when I first arrived in China, it turned out that one of my closest friends during the war, also a fellow language officer and so on, had become third secretary in the American Consulate General in Beijing. And when the communists came in, the consulate was completely cut off from its normal information contacts. When I was out in the university, and I had students traveling all over the country and coming back and talking about what they had seen, and I was close friends with a number of people in the faculty who were in the new government, and there was no security consciousness. They would just talk about everything. And then I'd go in on a weekend and have dinner with my wife, and I would go in and have dinner with our friends, and sometimes with the Consulate General himself, and we'd talk about what we'd heard and so on and so forth. Well, this kind of thing you can get away with in peacetime in most countries. But if war breaks out, you're in deep trouble. And if I'd been a German in the United States, I would have been in jail here. Not to mention a Japanese. I wouldn't even have done anything to be in jail for a Japanese. But when the Chinese went into Korea, my wife and I decided, I decided we'd better get the heck out of there. So we applied for exit visas, but they were temporarily denied. And we moved into the city to a little apartment there, a little house. And one day in July, there's a knock on the door, and I opened it, and there was half the Liberation Army, it seemed, with a warrant for my arrest. And I went off to jail. And my wife was placed under house arrest for 14 months, and then she was arrested too. They were trying to decide. One of the big problems they had to face in those days was how much a woman was involved in the crimes of her husband. Because so many women, traditional Chinese women, you know, they did what their husbands told them. I mean, that was it. And whether they understood it or not, they did what they were told. And so finally, I think they decided that Dell was intelligent enough to be culpable as an accessory. And so she was arrested too. In any case, I was sent off to jail.